people will say, "Oh, that's conspiracy theory," but there's actual things that are happening and that are documented, and that's not on the realms of speculation. Is the WEF has a partnership with Transport Canada for a digital ID scheme for traveling, which involves capturing biometrics and all these things. So this, you can read about it on Canada.ca. These are things that have been going on for a few years now. Having a country having its sovereignty or control over the information of its own citizens. And if you go further than that, then I think a lot of what we've talked about kind of goes back to COVID, whether the mandates or the Emergency Act, the Freedom Convoy, the fight against misinformation, disinformation, and now because of it, we're going into or near a recession. There's extremely high inflation. Central banks printed a lot of money. Lockdowns created problems with supply chains, and so we're caught in these multiple crises, and we're kind of forgetting what caused all of that.
Well, welcome to Freedom Feature, and I'm your host, Barry Bussey. With me today, I have a special guest, Noé Chartier, who is a Epoch Times reporter based out of Montreal. Welcome, Noé, to our program.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
Noé, I wonder if you could just share with our audience a wee bit about your background and what motivates you in your reporting.
I was involved with the French edition of the newspaper when it started back in 2005 in Montreal. Okay. So I was doing everything from writing, translating, taking photographs and all that. I did that until maybe 2009. Then I joined the public service. I was a researcher for quite a while until last fall when I went back to Epoch Times. So that's kind of my background in a nutshell. In terms of motivation, I guess it's what every journalist wants, is to find a good story, write a good story. And the challenge is, if you write mostly for web, then you'll be concerned with volume. So if you're into more investigative journalism, sometimes that can be a bit hard. And then finding the motivation is, you want to write something that has high impact for society, that's relevant, that people find interesting, and also things that have been maybe missed by other media or ignored or things like that. So when you can find a sort of combination of these elements, then that's a good day for sure.
Right on. Excellent. So now tell me a little bit about the Epoch Times. A lot of people may not know about it, or if they have known about it, they would have gotten it from, I've noticed some stories in the past where even some host people who are delivering the mail are struggling with whether or not they should deliver the newspaper. And I'm like, what? Why? What's happening here?
Yeah, I think you're referring to when we had special edition about when COVID started. I think we were putting out very cutting edge reporting about what was happening. And many of the things that we reported at that time, turned out to be true. About the origins of COVID and the suppression that was going on in China, about what they're trying to suppress at first, the doctors that they muzzled and all that stuff. So we had a lot of sort of reporting that people weren't seeing anywhere. And when they received the newspaper, some of them, for some reason, it didn't jive with maybe the information they were getting from elsewhere. That's this particular event you're referring to. But Epoch Times was started in 2000 by Chinese Americans that wanted to bring the truth about China, bring uncensored reporting. And I think this is, we still carry this mentality where we want to report the truth. We want to do it honestly and truthfully. That is, squarely what we try to do every day. We're not necessarily trying to compare or criticize what others are doing. It's just we have established a set of solid principles, and that's what we try to go when we do go about our business.
That's very important, it seems to me, in a democracy, to be able to have a source of news that is interested in the truth. A lot of organizations are afraid to even use that term. It strikes me that it's like old-fashioned journalism of trying to report exactly what's been happening.
Yeah, for sure. I think I also had this in mind, old-fashioned journalism, and there are a number of other outlets that also have this mission of keeping the government accountable and not following necessarily a party line. In terms of reporting, sometimes you'll be drawn to particular stories because of certain reasons. And I think that's also normal. But when you're reporting on issues that have high consequences, there's a duty to cover both sides and make sure that all voices are represented.
Yeah, and I think that's extremely important. The idea of keeping government accountable, if there's ever a time where that is needed, it is now, especially when government feels that they are to be giving money to news outlets. We know, for example, that CBC gets, what is it, $1.2 billion a year, plus the other major news organizations in Canada get something like 700 million a year divvied up amongst them. And of course, the whole idea of what they call the fourth estate, the idea that, newspapers, news organizations we've come to expect them in liberal democratic countries to be making sure that when government says something, that it is in fact corroborated by the truth, that it's not something where they're just trying to use propaganda to get their own agenda through and all of that kind of thing. But no, it's extremely important. And it seems to me that right now, one of the struggles I have with our current environment here in Canada is that we've got an asymmetrical alignment, it seems to me. It runs from the Prime Minister to even in the judiciary, I find, in academia, in the media, even in the population at large now, there's this sense of everyone is speaking out of the same songbook, so that there's very little ability to be able to have a difference of opinion. And those who do have a difference of opinion, like what we've seen over the last couple of years, for example, I've noticed there's this getting rid of those who would dissent from government. And I think it's extremely important to have organizations like the Epoch Times who are saying, hey, we need to look at exactly what's happening and reporting the facts as they are found, rather than trying to fit the facts to the narrative, as it were.
The information environment has changed, as you've pointed out, and there does seem to be sometimes an alignment, and you could argue that it sometimes it goes a bit further into academia, into corporations too. What it does is it creates an atmosphere where, as we've said a bit, speaking freely or speaking your mind or expressing your thoughts can become difficult if there's a backlash that can lead to a form of self-censorship or other kinds of censorship or pressure coming from social media or whatever. But it does seem like it's hard. It could be harder to express views that are not falling within a certain framework.
I've been very much interested in a number of stories that you have been writing over the last number of months. And I'm wondering if you could just share with our listeners about what is happening right now with the federal government's vaccine travel mandates. I noticed that there's a lot of discussion going on, and the government has now reissued the mandate for the next foreseeable future, it seems, at least for the next month anyhow.
Yes, about the federal mandates, I think it's good to sort of go back in time and see how they came about. So, the vaccines against COVID, they came online late 2020, early 2021, I think. And at that time, the government or Prime Minister Trudeau said it was basically up to everybody to make their own choice about if they were going to take it or not. And then the election came about and it became an election issue. I think Blacklock's reported that, they had done some psychographic polling and realized that it was an issue that they could gain politically from it. And it became an electoral promise to impose those mandates. And after the election, that's what happened.
Kind of reminds me as well of Joel Lightbound's criticism of his own government, saying that the government made a decision to go aggressive on that matter.
Yeah, I think before he came forward, everybody, like I said, there was this reporting where we kind of know that it's probably what they did. But then he came out with scathing criticism of that during that press conference, I think in early February, maybe February 8th or something. This lone press conference, he really he went out on a limb. So, and that's what he said. It says he could not tolerate the divisive posture or rhetoric that was coming out of his government. So, but to just maybe backtrack just a little bit. I mean, the government argues that they're necessary to reduce transmission and to increase vaccine uptake. So I think that's the two main arguments that they have. And the two main arguments against it are, constitutional and scientific. Opponents will say it violates mobility rights, and scientifically they'll say, well, there's no proof that the vaccines actually significantly reduce transmission. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing right now is we're looking at data, you look at science, and almost everybody too also starts to have a sense that vaccines do not provide lasting protection. They wane rapidly, and when there's new variants will evade vaccines.
With that recognition and that growing knowledge of the science, and when the Prime Minister said, it's because he's making his decisions on science, one wonders exactly how you arrive at these decisions. And I know, as a reporter, you're not into giving opinions or whatever, but have you heard of anyone in government who, like, I noticed there's MPs, not only conservatives, but also liberals are now saying, look, we should be reducing these travel mandates. Just the other day, I read a tweet from the CEO of WestJet, who I understand is originally from the Netherlands. And while he has been in favor in the past of the mandates, is saying, hey, look, the time has come to reduce these mandates, and with everything that's going on at the airport. But have you been picking up any other growing momentum, as it were, against the government policy?
You had the Conservatives that brought a motion to bring back the travel rules to pre-pandemic levels. And that was defeated by all parties in the House. And then there's Joel Lightbound from the Liberals who dissented. And also Nathaniel Erskine-Smith. He abstained because he wasn't in favor of removing the masks. But then he made the plea that he sees no need for it anymore. He says, well, I suggested to the government that they bring it to 3 doses. But then he went back and says, no, right now there's no need for it. So there's the pressure from the politicians. What I think is noteworthy, too, is the pressure that's coming from outside. The International Air Travel Association, IATA, on May 24th, said to the government, they represent, I think, 230 airlines in the world. Air Canada is part of them. WestJet is part of them. And they came out and said, okay, if you can't scrap these restrictions, at least can you do this? So they were taking a position against the travel restrictions. And this week, too, you have the tourism sector, hotels, that also are coming out and saying, we're going to lose our season right now. We're losing our competitive edge with other destinations that are very attractive for tourists, like Italy, Switzerland, and these places have removed their restrictions. So there's pressure building, and I don't think we've had that much pressure. Of course, you've had the Freedom Convoy back in February, but that was very, very domestic. And now it's coming from sectors that are not fringe. These are major players. There's a lot of money involved. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
There's been a number of lawsuits with respect to these vaccine mandates, and I noticed you've been doing some reporting on those. Can you share with our listeners where we are with respect to the litigation on these?
So there are 4 different lawsuits. The first one that was brought forward is by 2 businessmen, Sean Rickard and Carl Harrison. Maxime Bernier from the People's Party has one.
Right.
Brian Peckford, the former Newfoundland Premier, has one too with 5 co-applicants. These 2 are supported by the JCCF, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom.
Right. Yep.
And there's a 4th one, which is from a Quebec lawyer, Nabil Belkacem. Those are all challenging the travel mandate, and the court has decided to sort of hear them jointly. So they're following a same kind of schedule. So right now they're going through cross-examination of witnesses, and the hearings are planned for September. So that's in a nutshell what is going on. All these cases seem to be putting emphasis on one, they have a sort of strong angle to, some are more constitutional, and some are also based on scientific experts questioning the rationale.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating to see what's happening when you think of all of the loss with respect to the economy. I mean, obviously, we have to be balancing the interests of the economy, but also to balance the interests of health. And to see the government take such a hard stand on this, has there been any criticism of the government that you've seen with respect to? I wonder whether the government is just trying to make a political statement here as a result of the Freedom Convoy. Is that what's going on? Or have you heard any criticism that, hey, is the government just trying to poke a stick in people's eye, or, in saying, look, we're the ones in charge. We're going to let you know when the mandates are going to be let go. We're not going to be told what to do. We're going to be basing it on science. And then what's the kind of criticism that you're hearing?
It's really hard to understand the reasoning behind it. Like you said, some might say it's political because they don't want to give the conservatives a win, or some might say it's personality driven. It's anyone's guess, really. There's definitely some mixed messaging. The Prime Minister said, the pandemic is somewhat behind us. We're happy to see people traveling. And then this week, after the tourism industry came out, he said, no, we're very still much into this, and we need to prepare for future waves. Based on what we've seen, so far, waves come and go. Right now, we have a very high vaccination rates in Canada. There's arguably also a lot of people that have caught it. So there should be some baseline for herd immunity, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Is the government banking on another super wave crashing on Canada and then saying, well, look, we told you so. We had your back. We protected you. We kept you safe. While all the other places played with your health by removing all the restrictions. So maybe they're hoping that they'll be able to do this. I don't know if it's that. But the issue about saying it's about following science or public health advice, the Chief Public Health Officer, Theresa Tam, said a few weeks ago, we're moving away from requirements to recommendations. The mandates are under review. So these were all signals that she possibly was telling the government that requiring these things or mandating these things are not useful anymore. I don't know exactly what happens, but that's the message she was giving out. So another thing I would probably try to point out is that when the IATA came out 3 days after, the government was saying, we're working on this. We're creating this crisis cell to facilitate the airport, to remove the airport bottlenecks and all that. I have no idea if these two events are related, but maybe this outside pressure sort of helped. What we're seeing right now is that the other big player that could, help, that could sort of nudge Canada is the U.S. But right now, the two administrations, they share the same baseline.
Right.
The Biden administration probably would like to have the same kind of mandates that Canada has. A lot of them were defeated in the court. The mask mandate was defeated in court recently. They had issues passing the mandates for the businesses. So this is just pure speculation. But if the U.S. administration was not favorable to these, maybe it would be easier for the government here to be like, okay, we're done with that. So that's also another angle that is interesting.
Yeah, it is. And the whole point about how the courts in the United States have really held the government to account is something that I find fascinating in comparison to what's been happening in Canada. The courts have been very slow from my perspective with respect to allowing the cases to move ahead on an expedited basis because of the fact that we're involved in what is in essence a crisis of travel, a crisis of the rights for mobility and so on. But the courts, putting this off even to September is outrageous to me, especially when most of the travel would be done during the summer. And we don't get the same kind of access to justice in the same way, in an expedited way that we see happening down in the United States, where it seems to me the courts down there are very sympathetic to what is going on with the people who are suffering as a result of these mandates. Anyhow, that's something I've been thinking about and talking about with my legal colleagues over the last little while. One of the other things that you have been writing on that I've found very interesting, and that is the government's plans to regulate the internet. We've got C11, but also C18, which is another interesting piece. I'm just wondering if you could just open up those two pieces, and let's just have a little discussion about where we are on those.
Yeah, like you said, there's a number of bills that the government wants to pass to regulate the internet. C11 is the revamping of the Broadcasting Act.
Mm-hmm.
So it involves the CRTC, the regulator. I think the angle is to protect Canadian culture. They're seeing big tech taking a disproportionate part in the media content. In there's a clause or provision which grants the authority to the CRTC to be able to regulate user-generated content. The Heritage Minister, Pablo Rodriguez, has said that people that worry about it are conspiracy theorists. Meanwhile, the CRTC chair has said that, this bill effectively gives me that power, but I won't use it. So people that are concerned about it are saying, well, if it's just, I think it's section 4.1, 4.2, if this is the issue where user-generated content can be regulated, why not just strike it out? So I'm not an expert in that, but from what I see so far is that big media, legacy media, these organizations, they want this bill, whereas the small producers that have worked very hard to build an audience, an international audience sometimes, and that depend on revenues from some streaming services, they're not interested in that. They're saying they don't want the government to be involved in this. These are the issues surrounding this bill. There's a bit more because, for example, the original Act of 1991, I think it says, the broadcasting system of Canada needs to work for Canadian women, men, and children. And this is being struck out, and it's replaced by, it needs to work for racialized communities, people with different gender identities. So they're trying to cast this in a progressive framework. And I don't know if because of putting this into law and then giving the power to regulate, if it will have an impact. Will this be a case for if the content does not agree with what the act says, then it would be deemed inappropriate. I don't know.
It seems to me that if you give a child a hammer, everything becomes a nail, and if the government is going to have the ability to be able to determine whether or not the material that is being discussed or whatever here on the internet, then the government is going to indeed use it to enforce its own ideology. And I think this is the problem that we seem to be having with this current government, because it's not only one of the areas that I have worked on in the last 10 years has been in charity law. And I've seen over and over again where this government has been imposing its ideology on religious communities, for example. If they do not accept the progressive views of the government, then they don't get funding. And there's even now questioning whether or not they should be even receiving charitable status. This is one of the things that the Prime Minister talked about during the last election with the pro-life groups. And so, again, there's this alignment, an asymmetrical alignment where you've got to be in line with the way the government views the world. At least that's how I see it. That's how I see it coming up. And here with this legislation, our entire right of freedom of speech is now on the line. And I think as Canadians, from my perspective, is that we've got to be saying, okay, to say that we will just give the government this authority and, don't worry about it, we're good guys. Well, from what we have seen so far, in my view, from what I've observed, that no, they're not actually good guys. These are guys who are intent on pushing their agenda. But anyhow, I diverse. I kind of go off on a tangent here, but it just strikes me as something for you, our listeners who are watching, to be very concerned about.
For Bill C-11, I think the proponents will say, well, CRTC already kind of had that power. Some will say it's not equipped to deal with such a high volume of production. These are the sort of counter argument to people who would be overly worried about this. What I would recommend your listeners is people that are really interested in this. There's the Ottawa law professor, Michael Geist.
Yes.
He really understands the language of the law, and he's constantly commenting on these bills, and he's really keeping a close tab on them. There's also former CRTC Commissioner Peter Menzies, who writes as a columnist for us. He also understands the system, and people that want to have more information or better a grasp of it can go there. The concerns that you're raising about the issue of censorship, I think this is coming in another bill that doesn't have a name yet. The government has mandated an expert panel, 12 experts, to come up with ideas on this new legislation. This is the online harms reduction bill. I think the previous one was Bill C-36 in the last parliament.
Right.
So this one, for people that are concerned about what government could do to regulate speech online, this one that's coming up is probably higher on the scale. There's nothing that's been written about it so far, but I've looked into the background of the experts that have been chosen by the government. And what you can find is that most of them share some aspects of the tenets of the government. So, for example, there's one who would like to see more vaccine mandates. There's another one that was vehemently against the Freedom Convoy. There are some that are already on the government payroll by running government programs or that are heavily supported by government.
Objectivity is something that the government has a rough time with, to have someone who has a different opinion being part of their panel of experts. Online
harms also includes something that I think we all agree on, is to fight child exploitation. But among the 12 experts, there's, from just going from memory, there's only one who specializes in that field. All this is cloaked, Bill C-11, Bill C-18, and that future one is also cloaked in fighting the misinformation and disinformation. That's the two keywords that you hear in almost every press conference. Even if Bill C-11 is to favor Canadian content, you'll hear, okay, well, we also want to fight misinformation and disinformation by strengthening media. Bill C-18, the same thing. So this is the environment that we're in right now.
Yeah, it's a very scary environment. It's an environment that it seems to me that Canadians have not awakened to the reality of what we are facing as a country. I mean, never before have we seen such an assault on freedom of speech, freedom of expression as we have over the last several years. But as a result of the government giving itself even more power, these are the kinds of bills that we need to be very, very concerned about, because it's going to be too late to do much about it once the government gets the power. Because what will happen is that we will tend to self-regulate ourselves. So what will happen is that organizations who are on the internet or who are afraid because they don't have the means to be able to fight government in court and all the rest of it, it becomes a very big challenge when these matters come into law. And then when the government has the entire apparatus and basically an account of which there is no bottom, that they can spend money on ensuring that your particular view is disinformation, misinformation, you're probably bigoted, racist, misogynist, and all the rest of it, anti-science. And then it becomes a very, very hard row to hoe to be able to get through. And so it's important for us to be speaking out about these kinds of things now.
If you look at both sides, I think the government can be right in saying there's a lot of nastiness online.
Yes.
There's groups that are indeed extremists, that are indeed organizing. They're doing, but also the counter argument to that is the more you legislate, the more these things tend to go underground on encrypted platforms. And from a security perspective, I think some practitioners would say, well, you're driving them underground, so we're losing the ability to monitor them. If you let them speak freely on online platform, then you can see what they're planning to do or what they're thinking about and what their intent is a bit easier than if you put this very hard, it's tightly sealed, so there's nothing that goes out. Well, water always flows through and it'll find another way. So.
Takes the path of least resistance. That's a very good point. And I would be first to say, yes, I mean, we recognize that there are situations where no right is absolute. We recognize that. I think most people would. But the problem is who gets to decide what's disinformation and on what basis and what is the criteria that government would use. Just going against their own political ideology is not really a reason. But there are certain harms that definitely come as a result of those. We all recognize, for example, pornography is one that many people have referred to. In fact, governments have been regulating for a long time. I wonder that this is just a thought that just comes through my mind right now, and I'm just thinking out loud. But, one of the things that if government does over-regulate, like you say, they'll go underground. But another form of underground work that it seems to me that has been with us ever since the printing press is that, okay, so if people lose the ability to be able to speak online, what's there to stop various little print shops from opening up, which of course are, if you look at the whole discussion of freedom of speech, John Milton and others have talked about way back in the 1600s when government in England was trying to censor speech. And it just created more independent printing presses. And who knows, we may end up finding ourselves littered with paper across the country, where people are going to be printing their views and their opinions and handing it out anonymously in the public at large. And those are kinds of things that, even though we're so far advanced, technologically speaking, the old technologies may end up having a resurgence as a result of government cutting back. I don't know, but it just kind of struck me just now at thinking about this.
It'd be very interesting to see reverting to paper. The whole trend seems to be going quite the opposite way.
Going quite the opposite. But, it's interesting. I'm a great fan of the book 1984, and I wish we would treat it as fiction, but some government seemed to like the idea of making it reality. But, the whole concept of going back and changing what was the news in the past, by re-editing the old newspapers and all the rest of it. And so today that can be done very easily by the, digitally. But if we were to have a dystopian like what Orwell was talking about, but it seems to me that one of the ways in which we're able to recapture our history, it seems, is that we do revert back to books, in the sense that we get back to understanding the various perspectives in the past, our history, that kind of thing. That's something we've kind of lost in the digital age. So who knows? We may end up going back to some degree. I don't know. I'm just purely speculating and thinking out loud on that. Anything else then with respect to these legislation?
There's Bill C-18 the Online Streaming Act, which seeks to address the fact that a lot of advertising in traditional media has gone to big tech platforms. So this bill would make these companies strike deals with different media outlets so that there's a sort of revenue sharing. And the concerns, again, like I said, it's also framed as a way to, fight disinformation, or because it says, okay, we need to keep this. We need to keep a good press so that the government's accountable. So press is the means that we're gonna defeat misinformation. So we need to increase the revenues of the media. And I think some of the critics on that is that some organizations already have deals. Maybe the big outlets will just get the lion's shares. Maybe some smaller players will be left out. And then there's also the issue of Canada creating this qualified journalism organization tax scheme, where to be able to receive tax credits from the government needs to check your media and make sure that it follows certain rules, it produces its own content. And there's already fallout with Rebel News being denied status.
Yes, I was just thinking of that. Yeah.
So, and that's one outlet that's been very critical, and the government probably doesn't like very much. Mm-hmm. So them not getting a status, it starts to fall in that category where you're like, okay, well, that outlet which employs many people and it's alive and it's producing, well, it doesn't qualify, so it won't be receiving as much money. So all of these structures are creating this thing where media not only becomes dependent on big tech, but also on big government for protection. So it all comes back down to, okay, is this really what a free and independent media or press is? These are good questions we can ask.
Yes, and I think those are very important questions that Canadians need to address. Because like you say, with respect to Rebel News, it seems that the government has a particular animus against them, because if you look at, for the last couple of elections, they've prevented Rebel News reporters from even asking questions or being present at the leadership debates. And twice, as I understand it, they went to the federal court, and twice the federal court said, no, hey, you've got to allow Rebel News in. And it seems like there's a particular sense there that the Prime Minister does not have much appreciation for Rebel News. But here's the thing. They are very much, of course, a news organization that obviously the government doesn't appreciate. But it strikes me that when government gets to decide these kinds of questions, and they make life very difficult for organizations, then we got to ask ourselves, do we really have free speech in this country? And I think I think that this is going to be very fascinating to see how this plays out. And I think Canadians, look, you may not agree with what Rebel News or what some other news organization says or does, but surely we can all agree that we need to allow different perspectives, because if we only have that one asymmetrical opinion, then it's kind of like everyone's going to jump off the cliff together. But we need to have that ability to be able to communicate and to be able to have differences of opinion so we can determine exactly what is true, what is it that we ought to be doing as far as public policy and all of that kind of thing. So yeah, so this raises a good, and the thing is, as I understand it, right, the news organizations now are considered charities, and so people are charity-like, and so they receive a deduction when you donate or give money to these news organizations. Isn't that how it works?
It's part of it. So you would only be able to recoup that money if that organization that you're giving money to has that status. So
wow, it's fascinating. Absolutely. And see, here's where I'm connecting dots a little bit. And one of the reasons why, First Freedom's Foundation exists is that we are connecting dots. We are saying, look, the government's views over here do have an influence over there. And so one of the areas of concern that I've had in my practice has been dealing with charities who do not have the accepted opinion of the government on whatever issue it may be. And so therefore they don't get, government funding, as I mentioned before, Canada Summer Jobs. But in the same way that government is now going to seek to limit who is and is not a news organization, because they don't like Rebel News. Okay, so they're going to get rid of Rebel News. In the same way, it seems to me it's not too long in the distant future where they're going to say, well, we're not going to have this charitable organization, this church that has such unacceptable views on any number of the social issues that this government is interested in, and we will take away their charitable status. And I think that day is coming, quite frankly. And some people say, well, that's not an issue of freedom. It's an issue of, government largesse. But I think what happens is that when government removes those perks, as it were, or treats organizations differently based on their opinions, then the government is making in essence, a moral condemnation against those organizations and against the people who support them. As we saw with the Freedom Convoy, if you supported the Freedom Convoy, we will freeze your bank accounts. Well, the same kind of mentality is at work here. And again, it's through the entire government approach to organizations whose opinions it doesn't appreciate. And so that's where I'm connecting the dots. As we look at then some other freedom of speech issues, there are some freedom of speech issues in Quebec with respect to recent legislation on the French language. Do you have any updates with respect to what's happening there?
I think freedom of speech in Quebec is doing okay. Freedom to speak the language of your choice in a different context, that might be an issue. So Premier François Legault in Quebec he's pushed back against some of the things in the woke ideology, so cancel culture, systemic racism. There was a commission in Quebec about freedom of expression in universities, and the Premier supported that very much. So he is pushing back on some of the things that you would agree in terms of letting academia be able to debate freely ideas. So he's very much for that. So, but when it comes to language, then it's a different story in the sense that this issue that Quebecers feel that their language is being eroded, their culture is being eroded constantly, also in the cultural capital of Montreal, it creates this reflex where they're trying to protect that heritage. So the law that's come into, that was passed, Bill 96, it does reinforces greatly the current language laws. It makes French the official language of the administration. It impacts workplaces. It impacts the legal or official documents that are exchanged amongst parties that need to be translated into French. So it's a really long bill. I am not an expert on it. I've tried to grasp some of the big things. One of the worries that Anglophones had is that they thought they would not be able to see their doctor and talk in English with him. The law has a provision that says in certain matters of health or public safety, another language than French can be used. It's not that clear, and there's still worries. The Premier has said people should not worry about that. So I'll leave it at that. And then the Anglophones, they feel that they're a persecuted minority because they cannot express themselves. The services they receive, it might be more difficult for them. And also there's also provisions like immigrants, for the first 6 months, they can receive services in another language than French, so presumably English. But after that, it's only French. So it creates this dynamic where, immigrants might come to Quebec for a little while, and then they'll realize, well, I'm not ready necessarily to live my life in French, and then they'll move on to some other place. I mean, it's a huge issue here. Some lawyers have already said they're going to challenge it. There's I think the notwithstanding clause in the bill
Right.
that says that provincial jurisdiction supersedes the Charter of Rights. Quebec has already brought this up for Bill 21, which removes religious symbols, and public servants in positions of authority cannot wear religious symbols. So that's also a violation of, well, I would assume it would be a violation of the Charter of Rights. Anglophones, they feel their rights are being trampled on. And Quebec, that are attached to the language, feel the same way towards, the creeping of Anglophone culture. And that's from, way back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can certainly sympathize with that. I mean, it is the lone French enclave in a very large North American continent that's highly influenced by trade and entertainment and all the rest of it. I guess there is that greater discussion of, if a state, a province wants to be unique and the individuals are free to come and go, they've got their culture, they got their language. How are they going to protect it when everyone around them, the entire environment is anglicized? And so as a result, we get this kind of development in the law to make sure that, they get to keep their language. And to be honest with you, I'm one of those Canadians who wish that I had spent, and who knows, maybe I will someday. I'd love to spend a couple of years just living in some little outport in Quebec and just learning French and trying to understand the French culture more. That's always one of the things that I thought would be kind of neat to do. And so I can see how that's important, but I really appreciate the fact that the Quebec government is indeed wanting to allow greater freedom amongst the academic crowd about, seeking for truth and understanding in that context. Okay, so finally, I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that you've been writing on with respect to the parliamentary review of the Emergencies Act, the use of the Emergencies Act back in February. What have we learned so far with respect to the testimony that's been given in this review?
I think it's more what we haven't learned so far.
Okay.
People that want to get to the bottom of this are saying the same thing, I think. The government is using cabinet confidence, solicitor-client privilege to not reveal a lot of what took place behind the scene to come about to this decision. Some of the news in recent days has been around which law enforcement agency advised the government to invoke the act. Because Prime Minister Trudeau and Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino, they've said multiple times that invoking the act was based or requested based on advice from law enforcement. So a lot of police chiefs have been in front of committee. Brenda Lucky, RCMP Commissioner, Interim Chief Steve Bell of the Ottawa Police Service, and yesterday Peter Slowly, the former chief who resigned or was a mutually agreed separation.
It was encouraged to resign, I guess, perhaps.
And that happened on the day after the government invoked the act on February 15th.
Right.
All of them said, we didn't advise for it, we didn't request it. That remains an area of mystery. I've thought about it a little bit, and I think there's another law enforcement agency that no one's talking about, and that had a role in the blockades, and that's the Canadian Border Service Agency, CBSA. That's responsible for port of entries. You had blockades in Surrey, you had one in Coutts, Alberta, you had one in Emerson, Manitoba, and you had the big one in Windsor, the Ambassador Bridge. So I asked point blank CBSA, did you request or advise for the act? And when the public emergency order was declared, did you require to extend it, or did you ask that it be extended? And it did not confirm nor deny to me that it didn't. So for some reason, it doesn't want to state its position. It just said to me, the government decided to invoke the act. So perhaps it came from there. At this stage, it can only be speculation, but they could have confirmed, they could have said, it's not us. They
Right.
could have, and they didn't.
It's fascinating. I wonder if they just don't want to be obviously involved with speaking to a reporter, but perhaps if they were before the parliamentary review, they might. And is there any indication if they will appear?
They have appeared accompanying the Minister of Public Safety, but from my recollection, they weren't asked any question by the senators or the MPs. So maybe they'll go again. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the schedule to see which witnesses are coming. But the mood so far is that there's not much that's going to be revealed through this. It'll be interesting to see if the inquiry will go a different way.
Yeah, so it's again something else that unfortunately doesn't give us a whole lot of confidence on the other areas, in my view. It doesn't give me any confidence with respect to when the government says it's going to do something, i.e., when they say with C11, C18, and so forth, you can trust us with the use of this new powers. When here on the parliamentary review, they're doing everything to obfuscate and go around the issue without answering the questions. And then when we see, for example, saying on the one hand, we did this because of the request from the police forces and so on, and that doesn't seem to be bearing itself out, it causes us to begin raising other questions. And then recent reports I saw that there's been a number of cabinet orders and orders in council that have now been labeled as secret. And if a government has nothing to hide, it needs to open it up so that the public can have a view and see what on earth is happening here in this country. And so it becomes very concerning when government, which is required by the legislation to have this review. What I find interesting is that the way the review was, the terms of reference of the review, that's former Justice, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, is going to be doing a review. The terms of reference are basically all about the trucker convoy and not about the actions of the government. And I find this it's just a little rich, and yet we're seeing it in plain view in the sense of they're not revealing what all happened. I'm just wondering if you could share with us, I see our time is going by here already, but what stories should our audience be concerned about of freedom here in Canada in the coming weeks, months?
Well, there's a number of bills that we've talked about regulating the information, but also the recent bill on firearms. Prime Minister said it won't target lawful gun owners, but if you freeze the ban, sell, and transfer of handguns, that's effectively targeting lawful gun owners. There's something else coming up to the Minister of Public Safety. He wants to give the border agency the ability to download your phone content when you cross the border if there's reasonable ground or something. So that's severely intrusive. A lot of provinces, jurisdictions are planning to introduce digital ID. I'm not very familiar with the whole scheme, but I think that's another very intrusive measure that's coming up. I know for sure that Quebec and Ontario are working on it. Right now, there's a lot of talk about the World Economic Forum, its influence on Canada and all these things. People will say, oh, that's conspiracy theory, but there's actual things that are happening and that are documented, and that's not on the realms of speculation. Is the WEF has a partnership with Transport Canada for a digital ID scheme for traveling, which involves capturing biometrics and all these things. So this, you can read about it on canada.ca. These are things that have been going on for a few years now. It's interesting in the context of people being able to control their data and having a country having its sovereignty or control over the information of its own citizens. And if you go further than that, then I think a lot of what we've talked about kind of goes back to COVID, whether the mandates or the Emergency Act, the Freedom Convoy, the fight against misinformation, disinformation, and now because of it, we're going into or we're near a recession. There's extremely high inflation. Central banks printed a lot of money, and lockdowns created problems with supply chains. And so we're caught in these multiple crises, and we're kind of forgetting what caused all of that. In a sense, we're not looking at, we're so caught up that we're like, okay, well, what happened back then? Have we found out where COVID came from? No. Has China helped finding it out? No. Probably for self-preservation. So there's a lot of internal factors that are affecting our lives right now. But also, I think we should keep our eyes a little broader on other things that are happening elsewhere. For example, like if China had not, gone strong on lockdowns, would democracies have followed the way they did and applied essentially very hard measures on civil liberties?
Yeah.
So what other things coming up? What other democracies are gonna do that's gonna be in the same line in the future? So there's influences that are quite strong right now, as you pointed out, that are eroding what we thought was secured in terms of freedoms and civil liberties.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I just it just again reiterates as I'm listening to you and we've had our discussion here today, it just reiterates how extremely important, the price to pay for liberty is eternal vigilance, is what the Irish politician said many years ago. And it strikes me that is indeed the case. And what we see happening, there's so many fronts that our religious, well, not only religious, but our general freedom is being breached in many ways. It's almost kind of like there's so much happening, we all don't know how to process it all, but we have to be on top of it. And it is extremely important that we have voices like yours, like the Epoch Times, so that we can get to the bottom of what's happening. And I very much appreciate the great work that you do, Noé, just to even report on these issues. Many organizations are not even reporting to the same degree that you and the Epoch Times. And I want to applaud you. I want to thank you for the great work that you're doing. And I very much appreciate the fact that you were willing to give us of your time here today. Is there any final word or anything that comes to mind that you would like to share with our listeners before we close off?
I just want to thank you very much for inviting me. And to those that don't know Epoch Times, go check it out. We are producing a lot of news, not only Canadian focused, but we also have great coverage of U.S. politics. We're established in many countries, so we have we have a whole range of perspectives and information. We're developing great podcasts too. We have this Epoch TV service where we're talking to thought leaders, and we're having very unique investigations. So I encourage everybody to go check it out.
And where can they go? What's the address there?
Yeah, theepochtimes.com. Some articles might be behind a paywall. You can just submit an email and then you'll be able to receive it. I'm not super active on social media, but I'm there posting articles and sometimes posting things I find interesting, so people can reach me there if there's anything. My email there is as well. My DMs are open, as they say. If people have stories that they want to share and information that they have about a certain situation. So I wrote recently about the Purolator employees doing a legal action against the vaccine mandate. That was an exclusive story that was given to me. So if people have things that they feel strongly about, they want to share, well, I'll be happy to receive them.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Noé, for being with us. And I want to thank you, our viewers, for taking the time to listen in on our conversation as we looked at the issues of freedom across Canada that this one reporter is doing. And, as we have pointed out in the past, and we do again today, you may not agree with what the opinions that are being expressed here on this program, but that's okay. We're here to just provide open, transparent, and an opportunity for us to be able to deal with the issues as they come up. And so we thank you for being with us. And make sure you take the time to go over to our website at firstfreedoms.ca. Sign up there for our newsletter so you're kept up to date, because each week we send out a newsletter outlining the various interviews, the various op-eds that I've written, and other issues of interest. We just want to thank you for that, being willing to do that. Click that little like button there. That helps us as well. And until next time, I'm Barry Bussey. The fight for freedom consists not only in the legal battles in court, but also in the battle of ideas at the universities and in the media. It takes time, effort, and money to keep on top of the debates for freedom. Your donation allows us to keep fighting for all Canadians. Firstfreedoms.ca